The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 1889, delivered by a dust-covered rider who accepted his payment with the weary nod of a man who'd seen too many desperate correspondences cross his palm. Margaret Caldwell held the envelope with fingers that trembled not from cold but from the weight of months spent watching her father's health decline and their ranch slip toward foreclosure. The paper felt heavier than parchment should, weighted with decisions she wasn't ready to make but could no longer avoid. "Another one of those matrimonial responses?" asked her younger sister Emma, pausing in her embroidery to peer over Margaret's shoulder. At 19, Emma still possessed the luxury of believing that love would arrive naturally, without negotiation or contract, like wildflowers blooming unbidden in spring meadows. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She had placed advertisements in 3 newspapers across Colorado Territory, describing herself in terms she hoped sounded appealing without being dishonest: accomplished in domestic arts, well-educated, of sound health and moral character. What she hadn't mentioned was the desperation that drove her to seek a marriage of convenience, or the way her hands shook each morning when she reviewed the ranch's dwindling accounts. The first responses had been disappointing. Men seeking housekeepers more than wives, widowers with too many children and too little patience, fortune hunters who somehow sensed vulnerability despite her careful wording. This letter, however, bore the mark of quality paper and careful penmanship. The return address read James Harrison Blake, Blake Ranch, Posey Falls, Colorado Territory. She had heard the name whispered in respectful tones at the general store. The Blake family owned one of the largest cattle operations in the territory, with holdings that stretched across 3 counties and political influence that reached all the way to Denver. James Harrison Blake was the eldest son, a man of 32 who had never married, much to the consternation of ambitious mothers throughout the region. Margaret broke the seal with care, unfolding paper that crackled with expensive quality. The handwriting was bold and confident, the words chosen with precision that spoke of education and breeding. "Miss Caldwell, your advertisement intrigued me, not for its promises but for its restraint. In an age of flowery declarations and romantic nonsense, your practical approach suggests a woman of sense and substance. I find myself in need of a wife who understands that marriage, at its foundation, is a partnership of mutual benefit rather than a fairy tale. My ranch requires a mistress capable of managing social obligations and household affairs with grace and efficiency. In return, I offer security, comfort, and the protection of an established name. If you are amenable to discussing terms, I invite you to visit Blake Ranch as my guest for 1 week, during which we might determine our compatibility without obligation on either side. I have enclosed funds for travel expenses and appropriate accommodations. Should you accept, please send word by return messenger, and I will arrange for your escort. Respectfully yours, James Harrison Blake." Margaret read the letter twice, her practical mind cataloging both the opportunities and the risks. James Blake was offering exactly what she needed: financial security, social position, and relief from the crushing responsibility of saving her family's legacy single-handedly. Yet something in the formal tone troubled her, a coldness that suggested their potential union would be more business arrangement than marriage. "Well," Emma pressed, abandoning her needlework entirely. "What does this one say?" Margaret folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her skirt pocket. "He wants to meet me. A week's visit to determine suitability." Emma's eyes brightened with romantic possibilities. "How exciting! Is he handsome? Does he mention love at all?" "It's not that kind of letter," Margaret replied, moving to the window where she could see their father's cattle grazing in pastures that would soon belong to the bank if she couldn't find a solution. "He's practical, businesslike. But surely there's some warmth? Some indication of feeling?" Margaret shook her head, though she felt a strange flutter of anticipation despite the letter's formal tone. Perhaps it was better this way, she told herself. Romantic entanglements complicated matters, created expectations that led to disappointment and heartbreak. A marriage based on mutual respect and practical considerations might prove more stable than one built on fleeting passion. That evening, As she helped her father with his evening medication, she mentioned the invitation. Samuel Caldwell had been a robust man once, a successful rancher who'd built their modest spread through hard work and careful planning. Now, weakened by consumption and the weight of financial failure, he seemed to shrink further into his chair each day. "Blake?" he wheezed, his eyes sharpening with interest. "James Harrison Blake? Margaret, child, do you understand what this means?" "It means a possible solution to our difficulties," she replied carefully. Her father grasped her hand with surprising strength. "It means much more than that. The Blakes are territorial aristocracy, as close to nobility as this rough country allows. Marriage into that family would secure not just your future, but Emma's as well. She could make a proper match instead of settling for some cowhand or shopkeeper." Margaret felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Since her mother's death 5 years earlier, she had managed their household, nursed her father through his illness, and watched their financial situation deteriorate despite her best efforts. The idea that one decision could solve all their problems seemed almost too fortunate to trust. 3 days later, she stood on the depot platform in Posey Falls, her traveling dress carefully pressed and her best bonnet secured against the autumn wind. The train journey had given her time to consider what she was about to undertake, but now, faced with the reality of meeting James Blake, her confidence wavered. A carriage waited near the station, its black lacquer gleaming and its brass fittings polished to perfection. The driver, a weathered man in livery, approached her with respectful deference. "Miss Caldwell? I'm Murphy, from Blake Ranch. Mr. James sent me to collect you." The ride through the countryside revealed the extent of Blake Holdings. Pastures stretched to the horizon, dotted with prime cattle bearing the distinctive Blake brand. Fences were perfectly maintained, outbuildings freshly painted, workers moving with the efficiency of a well-managed operation. Margaret found herself impressed despite her nervousness. Blake Ranch House appeared gradually, first as a shimmer in the distance, then resolving into an imposing structure that seemed to rise from the landscape like a statement of permanence and prosperity. Built of local stone and timber, it commanded the surrounding valley with quiet authority. Wide verandas wrapped around the lower level, while gabled windows punctuated the upper story like watchful eyes. As the carriage drew to a halt before the main entrance, Margaret straightened her shoulders and summoned her courage. Whatever happened during the next week would determine not only her future but the fate of her family's ranch and her sister's prospects. She had come this far. There could be no retreat now. The front door opened before Murphy could assist her from the carriage. A woman emerged, tall and elegant in dark silk, her graying hair arranged in an impeccable chignon. Everything about her bearing suggested refinement and authority. "Miss Caldwell, welcome to Blake Ranch. I am Eleanor Blake, James's mother. We are delighted to have you as our guest." Margaret accepted the offered hand, noting the firm grip and assessing gaze. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Blake. The journey was quite comfortable. I'm sure you're eager to freshen up after your travels. Maria will show you to your room, and we'll gather for dinner at 7. James is unfortunately delayed with business matters, but he should return by evening." As Margaret followed a young Mexican woman up a grand staircase, she caught glimpses of the ranch's interior. Oil paintings of prize cattle and family portraits, furniture that spoke of both comfort and considerable expense, windows that framed the vast landscape like living artwork. Her room, when they reached it, was larger than the entire parlor at her family's ranch, furnished with pieces that belonged in a Denver mansion rather than a frontier home. Left alone, Margaret unpacked her modest belongings, acutely aware of how out of place her simple dresses would look in such surroundings. She had brought her best gowns, but they seemed suddenly shabby compared to the elegance surrounding her. As she arranged her few toiletries on the marble-topped washstand, she wondered what James Blake would think of a woman whose entire wardrobe could fit in a single trunk. A knock at the door interrupted her unpacking. "Miss Caldwell? I'm Sarah, Mrs. Blake's personal maid. She sent me to assist you in preparing for dinner, if you'd like." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She would need all the help she could get to make a favorable impression. Sarah proved to be a treasure, arranging Margaret's hair with skilled fingers and suggesting subtle adjustments to her dress that somehow transformed her appearance from country respectable to nearly fashionable. "You have beautiful hair," Sarah commented as she worked. "Mr. James will be pleased. He's always admired ladies with natural coloring." "You know his preferences?" Margaret asked, surprised by the observation. Sarah blushed slightly. "I've worked for the family for 8 years. I've seen the ladies who've come calling, hoping to catch his interest. He's very particular." "And what does he find appealing?" "Intelligence," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Beauty fades, he always says, but a sharp mind grows more valuable with time. He's got no patience for silly girls who can't hold a conversation beyond fashion and gossip." Margaret felt a flutter of encouragement. If James Blake valued intelligence over mere prettiness, perhaps her chances were better than she'd dared hope. She had always been considered clever, though her practical education had focused more on ranch management than feminine accomplishments. At precisely 7 o'clock she descended the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the polished banister for support. The dining room lay through carved double doors, illuminated by the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Eleanor Blake waited near the fireplace, resplendent in burgundy silk that emphasized her dignified bearing. "You look lovely, dear," Eleanor said, though her appraising gaze missed no detail. "The blue becomes you beautifully." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of boots on hardwood announced another presence. She turned toward the doorway and felt her breath catch as James Harrison Blake entered the room. He was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders that filled his dark evening coat to perfection. His hair was black as midnight, slightly tousled from the wind, and his eyes were the deep green of summer grass after rain. But it was his bearing that struck her most forcefully. The quiet confidence of a man accustomed to command, tempered by an intelligence that seemed to catalogue every detail of his surroundings. Their eyes met across the room, and Margaret felt a shock of awareness that had nothing to do with practical considerations or business arrangements. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply looked at each other, measuring and assessing while something entirely unexpected flickered between them. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying the educated accent she'd expected but warmed by an undertone that sent an inexplicable shiver down her spine. "I apologize for my tardiness. Ranch business has a way of ignoring social schedules." He crossed to her with the fluid grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, taking her offered hand in both of his. The contact sent warmth shooting up her arm, and she found herself looking up into eyes that held depths she hadn't anticipated from his businesslike correspondence. "Mr. Blake," she managed, proud that her voice remained steady, "thank you for inviting me to your home. It's even more beautiful than I imagined." "As are you," he replied, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did her. A flush crept up his neck, and he cleared his throat. "That is, I hope you'll find your stay comfortable and enlightening." Eleanor Blake's knowing smile suggested she had noticed the unexpected tension between them, but she gracefully steered the conversation toward safer ground as they moved to the dining table. The meal that followed was an education in frontier elegance, with courses that would have done credit to the finest Denver restaurants served on china that belonged in a museum. The conversation flowed more easily than Margaret had dared hope. James proved to be an engaging dinner companion, well-read and thoughtful, with strong opinions tempered by genuine curiosity about others' perspectives. When he learned of her experience managing her family's ranch during her father's illness, his respect was evident in the quality of his attention. "It's unusual to find a lady with practical knowledge of cattle ranching," he observed, refilling her wine-glass with his own hands rather than waiting for the hovering servant. "Most women consider such matters beneath their notice." "Necessity has a way of expanding one's interests," Margaret replied. "When circumstances demand it, propriety becomes a luxury one can't afford." Spoken like someone who understands that survival requires adaptation, Eleanor interjected approvingly. I've always believed that the finest ladies are those who can rise to meet whatever challenges life presents. James nodded, his green eyes fixed on Margaret's face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Indeed, beauty without substance is like a flower without roots, lovely for a season, then gone without trace. The evening continued with increasing ease, punctuated by laughter and spirited discussion of everything from literature to politics to the future of the cattle industry. Margaret found herself forgetting the practical nature of her visit, caught up in the pleasure of conversing with minds that challenged and stimulated her own. When Eleanor excused herself for the evening, claiming fatigue, Margaret sensed the older woman's departure was strategic rather than necessary. Left alone with James in the elegant parlor, she felt the weight of expectation settle around them like morning mist. "Would you care to see the library?" James asked, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "I suspect you might appreciate the collection." The library proved to be a book lover's paradise, with volumes ranging from classical literature to the latest agricultural journals. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, while tall windows offered views of the moonlit landscape. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, creating an atmosphere of intimate warmth. "This is magnificent," Margaret breathed, running her fingers along the leather spines of first editions that represented a fortune in themselves. "You must spend considerable time here." "It's my refuge," James admitted, moving to stand beside her near the poetry section. "When the demands of business become overwhelming, I find solace in other men's words." She pulled a volume of Browning from the shelf, letting it fall open to a familiar passage. "I know the feeling. During the worst of my father's illness, books were my escape from responsibilities I sometimes felt too young to bear." James moved closer, reading over her shoulder, and she became acutely aware of his presence. The subtle scent of sandalwood and leather, the warmth radiating from his body, the way his breathing seemed to synchronize with hers. "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways," he read softly, his voice carrying an undertone that made the familiar words sound like a personal declaration. "I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach." Margaret closed the book with trembling fingers, the romantic poetry suddenly too intimate for the charged atmosphere between them. "Perhaps we should return to the parlor." But James caught her hand as she moved to replace the volume, his touch sending electricity through her entire being. "Margaret," he said, her given name sounding different in his deep voice, invested with meaning that went far beyond mere identification. She looked up into his eyes and saw her own confusion reflected there. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, a practical solution to mutual needs. Neither of them had expected the spark of genuine attraction that crackled between them like summer lightning. "This wasn't what I planned," he said quietly, his thumb tracing across her knuckles in a caress that made her breath catch. "When I wrote that letter, I thought I wanted a marriage of convenience, a sensible arrangement between compatible people." "And now?" she whispered, hardly daring to voice the question. His free hand rose to cup her cheek, the gesture so gentle it nearly broke her heart. "Now I find myself wondering if perhaps there might be room for something more. Something I didn't dare hope for." The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of possibility. Margaret felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by an attraction that defied logic and threatened to complicate everything she had planned. This was supposed to be simple, a business arrangement to save her family's ranch. She couldn't afford the luxury of romantic feelings, couldn't risk her family's future on the uncertain promise of love. And yet, standing in the firelight with James's hand gentle against her face and his eyes full of questions she longed to answer, she found herself forgetting every practical consideration that had brought her here. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt like a woman rather than merely a dutiful daughter and responsible sister. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 times, breaking the spell. James stepped back with visible effort, his hand falling to his side as propriety reasserted itself. "I should allow you to rest," he said, though his eyes suggested rest was the last thing on his mind. "Tomorrow I'll show you the ranch properly, if you'd like. Help you understand what life here would entail." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. As he escorted her to the foot of the grand staircase, she was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the way his hand briefly touched the small of her back in a gesture of support that felt far more intimate than mere politeness. "Good night, Margaret," he said softly, and again her name sounded different in his voice, invested with promise and possibility. "Good night, James," she replied, the use of his given name feeling like a small rebellion against the formal distance they were supposed to maintain. As she climbed the stairs to her luxurious guest room, Margaret's mind raced with the implications of what had just occurred. She had come to Blake Ranch seeking a marriage of convenience, a practical solution to her family's financial crisis. Instead, she found herself attracted to a man who seemed equally drawn to her, complicating what should have been a straightforward negotiation. Lying in the magnificent four-poster bed, surrounded by luxury she had never experienced, Margaret stared at the ceiling and wondered what the remaining days of her visit would bring. One evening had already shattered her preconceptions about James Blake and forced her to confront the possibility that practical arrangements might give way to deeper feelings. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She had responsibilities, obligations that extended far beyond her own desires. Could she afford to risk her family's future on the uncertain promise of love? Or would duty demand that she accept James's original proposal, regardless of the attraction growing between them? Outside her window, the Colorado night stretched vast and star-filled, holding secrets and possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to understand both James and herself better. Tonight, however, she would lie wakeful in her elegant bed and wonder if she was brave enough to reach for happiness that had never been part of her careful plans. The autumn wind sighed through the cottonwoods surrounding Blake Ranch, carrying whispers of change and promise. In the morning, Margaret would begin to discover whether those whispers spoke of heartbreak or hope, whether the practical woman who had answered a businessman's letter might dare to become something more, a woman willing to risk everything for the possibility of love she had never expected to find. Margaret replied quietly as she brushed out her travel-worn skirts. "Perhaps, but beauty without substance grows tiresome quickly." Sarah smiled in the mirror's reflection. "Mr. James has always said the same thing. His mother raised him to value character over ornament. There was a time, years back, when every eligible young lady in 3 territories set her cap for him. Beautiful girls, wealthy girls, girls with impeccable breeding and accomplishments. But none of them held his interest beyond a few polite dances." Margaret found herself curious despite her better judgment. What happened to change that pattern? Sarah's expression grew thoughtful as she arranged Margaret's hair for the night. "I think Mr. James grew tired of conversations that never went deeper than the weather or the latest fashions. He once told his mother that he'd rather live alone than spend his life with someone who couldn't challenge his thoughts or share his dreams. Said he wanted a partner, not an ornament." Despite Sarah's reassurances, Margaret slept poorly, her dreams filled with images of Clarissa's perfect deportment and Victoria's calculating gaze. The borrowed nightgown felt strange against her skin, another reminder of how out of place she was in this world of casual luxury. When morning arrived gray and overcast, she dressed with particular care, selecting her most becoming day dress and arranging her hair with unusual attention to detail. If she was to compete with a woman trained from birth to win James's approval, she would need every advantage her modest resources could provide. The dining room buzzed with feminine voices when she descended for breakfast, Victoria's melodic tones predominating as she orchestrated the morning's activities with military precision. Clarissa sat beside her mother like a beautiful doll, nodding agreement to plans being made around her with the passive compliance of someone accustomed to having decisions made on her behalf. "Ah, Miss Caldwell," Victoria called warmly as Margaret entered. "How perfectly timed. We were just discussing today's entertainment. I thought a morning ride would be delightful, followed by a proper tour of the house for our dear Clarissa. She's been away so long, she's forgotten many of the improvements we've made. Eleanor's expression suggested she found Victoria's assumption of hostess duties presumptuous, but she maintained polite composure. "How thoughtful of you to take such interest in reacquainting Clarissa with her childhood haunts." James entered the dining room as Victoria was outlining her plans, his hair still damp from washing and his expression already showing signs of strain. Margaret felt that familiar flutter of awareness at his presence, complicated now by memory of their library encounter and the growing certainty that their week of quiet acquaintance was rapidly becoming something far more complex. "Good morning, ladies," he said, his gaze finding Margaret's across the room with unmistakable warmth before duty forced him to acknowledge his other guests. "I trust everyone slept comfortably?" "Divinely," Victoria purred, gesturing for him to take the seat beside Clarissa. "The country air is so restorative after the close atmosphere of city life. Clarissa was just saying how much she's missed the freedom of ranch living." Clarissa smiled prettily at this attribution, though Margaret noticed the girl's hands remained soft and pale, unmarked by any outdoor activity more strenuous than gentle walks in manicured gardens. Her riding habit, when she appeared later that morning, was clearly new and fashioned for appearance rather than practical use, its immaculate condition suggesting it had never encountered actual ranch conditions. The morning ride became another carefully staged performance, with Victoria maneuvering the group so that James and Clarissa rode together while she engaged Margaret in conversation designed to highlight the differences in their backgrounds and expectations. They toured the eastern pastures where prize cattle grazed in pastoral splendor, Victoria pointing out improvements made during Clarissa's absence and reminiscing about childhood visits when James and Clarissa had been inseparable companions. "They were such devoted cousins," Victoria mentioned as they paused near a creek where cottonwoods provided welcome shade. "James always looked after Clarissa so carefully, making sure she wasn't frightened by the larger horses or overwhelmed by too much sun. Even as children, they seemed perfectly matched in temperament." Margaret watched the pair in question, noting how James maintained polite distance while Clarissa edged her mount closer with calculated persistence. The girls' conversation consisted primarily of admiring observations about the landscape and nostalgic references to shared memories, punctuated by helpless requests for James's assistance with her reins, her stirrups, or her horse's supposedly difficult behavior. "Clarissa has such a gentle nature," Victoria continued, her voice carrying clearly enough for James to hear. "She would never dream of interfering in business matters or questioning decisions better left to masculine judgment. Some women seem to think they should involve themselves in affairs beyond their sphere, but Clarissa understands that a lady's role is to provide comfort and beauty rather than complications." The pointed nature of this commentary was unmistakable, designed to remind James of traditional expectations while suggesting that Margaret represented a departure from proper feminine behavior. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks but refused to respond to the provocation, instead focusing on the magnificent landscape surrounding them. When they returned to the house for luncheon, Margaret discovered that Victoria's reorganization of the day extended far beyond morning activities. The dining room had been transformed with fresh flowers, elegant place settings, and an array of dishes that showcased the kitchen's finest capabilities. Additional guests had been invited, neighboring ranchers and their families, local businessmen, and several unattached gentlemen whose presence suggested Victoria's determination to provide Margaret with alternative romantic prospects. "I took the liberty of arranging a small gathering," Victoria explained as guests began arriving in the main parlor. "Nothing elaborate, just an opportunity for Miss Caldwell to meet some of our local society. I'm sure she'll find our community quite welcoming to newcomers." Among the assembled guests, Margaret recognized the subtle campaign being waged on multiple fronts. The married women assessed her with varying degrees of curiosity and speculation, clearly intrigued by the mysterious visitor who had captured James Blake's attention. The unmarried ladies evaluated her as potential competition, their careful politeness masking calculations about her advantages and vulnerabilities. Most significantly, Victoria had assembled an impressive collection of eligible gentlemen, each representing different types of security and social position. Mr. Charles Weaver, the prosperous merchant, offered financial stability and respectability. Dr. Samuel Mullins provided professional standing and intellectual companionship. Captain William Hayes, recently retired from military service, brought adventure and worldly experience. Each man had been carefully selected to appeal to different aspects of Margaret's practical nature, while demonstrating that James Blake was not her only option for advantageous marriage. The luncheon conversation flowed with practiced social ease, but Margaret found herself acutely aware of the undercurrents flowing beneath polite exchanges. Victoria orchestrated seating arrangements that placed Margaret between Mr. Weaver and Dr. Mullins, while ensuring that Clarissa occupied the place of honor beside James. Every topic of conversation seemed designed to highlight either Clarissa's accomplishments or Margaret's alternatives, creating subtle pressure from multiple directions. "Miss Caldwell," Mr. Weaver said during a discussion of local business prospects, "I understand you have experience managing agricultural operations. How refreshing to meet a lady who understands commercial realities. My late wife shared that practical inclination, and I found it invaluable in building our enterprises." "Miss Caldwell's background is certainly comprehensive," Victoria interjected smoothly, "though I sometimes think such extensive practical knowledge might overwhelm a lady's natural sensibilities. Clarissa, dear, perhaps you could favor us with your thoughts on the new church social plans." The redirection was masterful, shifting attention from Margaret's competence to Clarissa's social graces while subtly suggesting that too much practical knowledge was somehow unfeminine. Margaret watched James's jaw tighten at his aunt's manipulation, but social conventions prevented him from openly objecting to his guest's behavior. Dr. Mullins proved more genuinely engaging, drawing Margaret into discussion of medical treatments for livestock diseases and expressing authentic interest in her experiences. "It's unusual to find someone with such detailed knowledge of animal husbandry," he observed. "Have you considered that those skills might translate well to human medicine? I'm always seeking assistance from people who understand anatomy and aren't squeamish about difficult procedures." Before Margaret could respond, Clarissa's silvery laugh drew attention back to her corner of the table. "Oh, Dr. Mullins, how dreadful! Surely no lady should have to think about such unpleasant medical matters. I would faint at the mere mention of surgical procedures." The contrast was deliberate and devastating. Practical Margaret discussing diseases and medical treatments while delicate Clarissa couldn't even contemplate such indelicate subjects. Victoria beamed approval at her daughter's display of feminine sensibility, while several other ladies nodded agreement about the impropriety of exposing refined minds to harsh medical realities. James set down his wine glass with enough force to draw attention. "I find it admirable when people possess knowledge that allows them to help others, regardless of whether that knowledge is conventionally feminine. Courage and competence shouldn't be confined by arbitrary social expectations." The statement carried enough authority to silence immediate disagreement, but Margaret could see the disapproving glances exchanged among some guests. James's defense of her practical knowledge was appreciated, but it also marked her more clearly as an unconventional choice that challenged established social norms. After luncheon, Victoria suggested they adjourn to the music room where Clarissa might demonstrate her latest accomplishments. The performance that followed was technically proficient but emotionally sterile, each note perfect but lacking the passion that transforms mere skill into art. Clarissa's repertoire consisted entirely of fashionable pieces calculated to showcase her training without revealing anything of her inner nature. When polite applause had acknowledged the performance, Victoria turned expectant eyes toward Margaret. "Perhaps Miss Caldwell would honor us with some musical offering? I'm sure she has talents that complement her unique background." The request felt more like a trap than an invitation, designed to highlight Margaret's lack of formal musical training in contrast to Clarissa's conservatory education. Margaret rose with as much grace as she could muster, approaching the elegant piano with awareness that whatever she played would be found wanting by conventional standards. "I'm afraid my musical education was rather different from Miss Clarissa's," she said, settling onto the piano bench with hands that trembled slightly. "My mother taught me simple pieces, mostly hymns and folk songs that brought comfort during difficult times." The melody that emerged was indeed simple, an old hymn about finding strength through hardship, played with modest technique but genuine feeling. Margaret's voice joined the accompaniment in clear, true tones that filled the room with honest emotion rather than calculated display. When the last notes faded, the silence held a different quality than had followed Clarissa's performance. James's eyes never left her face during the entire piece, his expression holding something approaching wonder. When she returned to her seat, he leaned close enough to murmur, "That was beautiful. Real music, not just technical exercise." Victoria's smile had become noticeably strained. "How rustic and charming. There's something to be said for simple country melodies, I suppose, though they lack the sophistication of properly composed pieces." The afternoon continued with similar subtle warfare, Victoria finding countless ways to emphasize Clarissa's suitability while highlighting Margaret's differences. When the conversation turned to household management, Clarissa described her theoretical knowledge of entertaining and domestic arts in terms that suggested she expected to supervise rather than participate. Margaret's practical experience cooking, cleaning, and managing actual household tasks was presented as evidence of her lower social standing rather than valuable capability. "Of course, a lady of proper breeding shouldn't need to soil her hands with menial labor," Victoria observed. "Clarissa has been trained to oversee servants and organize social functions rather than perform actual work. That's the proper role for a woman of her station." Dr. Mullins raised an eyebrow at this pronouncement. "I've always found that understanding work makes one better at directing it. Miss Caldwell's hands-on experience would seem an advantage rather than a disadvantage." "Perhaps in some circles," Victoria conceded with barely concealed disdain. "Though in refined society, such comprehensive knowledge of domestic tasks might be considered evidence of reduced circumstances rather than admirable capability." Margaret felt the insult burn, but before she could respond, Eleanor Blake's voice cut through the tension with steel disguised as silk. "I've always believed that true refinement lies in character rather than ignorance. A woman who understands work has depth that mere ornamental accomplishments cannot provide." The battle lines were clearly drawn now, Victoria and her supporters favoring traditional feminine helplessness, Eleanor defending practical capability, and the male guests split between those who valued competence and those who preferred decorative compliance. Margaret found herself at the center of a debate about women's proper role that went far beyond her individual situation. When the guests finally departed in late afternoon, Margaret retreated to her room with a headache that had nothing to do with the weather. Sarah appeared with sympathetic efficiency, bringing cool cloths and gentle conversation. "Don't let them discourage you, miss," Sarah said as she helped Margaret out of her formal day dress. "Mrs. Victoria's been scheming to make Miss Clarissa the next Mrs. Blake for years, but Mr. James has never shown the slightest romantic interest. He's polite because she's family, but there's no warmth there." "But she's everything a man in his position should want," Margaret replied wearily. "Beautiful, accomplished, well-connected, and trained specifically to be his wife. I'm an outsider with no fortune, no connections, and skills that apparently mark me as unsuitable for refined society." Sarah's eyes flashed with uncharacteristic anger. "Begging your pardon, miss, but that's exactly what's wrong with refined society. They value appearance over substance, breeding over character. Mr. James has more sense than to choose a wife based on other people's expectations." That evening's dinner provided no relief from the day's tensions. Victoria had arranged the seating to maximize opportunities for private conversation between James and Clarissa while ensuring that Margaret remained occupied with other guests. The meal proceeded with elaborate courtesy masking growing strain, conversation flowing around topics calculated to exclude Margaret or demonstrate her unfamiliarity with elite social customs. When the ladies withdrew to the parlor after dinner, leaving the gentlemen to their port and cigars, Victoria finally abandoned subtle maneuvering for direct confrontation. "Miss Caldwell," she said with deceptive sweetness, "I hope you've enjoyed your visit to our little community. You must find it quite different from your usual circumstances." "Very different," Margaret agreed carefully, sensing the trap being prepared. "I imagine it's been enlightening to see how established families live," Victoria continued, settling into her chair with the confidence of someone about to deliver a decisive blow. "The responsibilities, the expectations, the careful consideration that goes into maintaining social position and family legacy." Eleanor's expression warned Margaret to proceed cautiously, but dignity demanded some response. "I've certainly gained appreciation for the complexities involved in managing large estates and social obligations." "Precisely," Victoria purred. "Which is why I feel compelled to speak frankly, woman to woman. James is a dear boy, but he's always been somewhat idealistic in his thinking. He sometimes allows romantic notions to cloud his practical judgment." Margaret felt her spine straighten. "I'm not sure I understand your meaning." "Oh, I think you understand perfectly," Victoria replied, her mask of courtesy finally slipping to reveal calculated ruthlessness beneath. "You're an intelligent woman, Miss Caldwell. Surely you recognize that James's interest in you represents a momentary fascination with the unconventional rather than serious matrimonial intent." The words hit like physical blows, but Margaret forced herself to maintain composure. "You seem very certain of Mr. Blake's intentions." "I should be," Victoria said with triumphant confidence. "I've helped raise him since childhood, guided his education, advised him on matters of business and social responsibility. James has obligations that extend far beyond personal preference, obligations to family, to the ranch's future, to maintaining the position his father and grandfather worked so hard to establish." Eleanor started to speak, but Victoria continued with gathering momentum. "A marriage to Clarissa would unite two branches of the family, consolidate holdings that have been separate too long, and ensure that future generations maintain both wealth and social standing. A marriage to anyone else would fragment the family's resources and diminish its influence." "You speak of marriage as though it were a business merger rather than a personal relationship," Margaret observed, proud that her voice remained steady. "In families like ours, marriage is business," Victoria replied bluntly. "Love is a luxury we can't afford when so much depends on making appropriate connections. James may think he's free to choose based on personal inclination, but he'll soon realize that duty must outweigh desire." Clarissa spoke for the first time since dinner, her voice carrying a tremulous quality that suggested genuine emotion beneath her practiced composure. "I've loved James since childhood. I've shaped my entire life around the hope of becoming his wife. Surely that devotion means something." Margaret felt unexpected sympathy for the girl, recognizing the genuine pain behind her careful facade. Clarissa had been raised as a sacrifice to family ambition, trained from birth to win a man's love through perfect compliance rather than authentic connection. In her own way, she was as trapped by family expectations as James was by inheritance obligations. "Devotion built on hope rather than mutual feeling is a fragile foundation for marriage," Margaret said gently. "Surely you deserve a husband who chooses you freely rather than accepts you from duty?" Tears gathered in Clarissa's blue eyes. "But I don't want anyone else. I've never wanted anyone else. James is my whole world." The pathetic confession hung in the air like an accusation, highlighting the tragedy of a life so narrowly focused that it could imagine no alternative sources of happiness. Victoria's face tightened with displeasure at her daughter's emotional display, clearly preferring calculating manipulation to honest vulnerability. "Clarissa's feelings are irrelevant to the larger issues at stake," Victoria said coldly. "This family's future depends on making wise choices rather than indulging romantic sentiment. Miss Caldwell, I ask you directly, are you prepared to be responsible for destroying everything the Blake family has built? Can you live with knowing that your selfish pursuit of advantage has damaged not only James's prospects but the welfare of everyone connected to this ranch?" The attack was so vicious that Margaret gasped, unprepared for such direct cruelty despite the day's accumulating hostilities. Eleanor rose from her chair with fury blazing in her eyes, but before she could respond, James's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's quite enough." He stood in the parlor doorway, his formal dinner clothes somehow making him appear more imposing rather than civilized. His face was pale with controlled rage, and his green eyes held depths of anger that made even Victoria falter in her aggressive confidence. "James, darling," Victoria began with forced brightness, "we were just having a pleasant conversation about—" "I heard every word," he said with quiet intensity that was more frightening than shouting would have been. "I heard you attempt to manipulate Miss Caldwell through guilt and intimidation. I heard you reduce my cousin to a pathetic display of manufactured devotion. Most disturbingly, I heard you speak of marriage as though human beings were cattle to be bred for optimal production." Victoria's composure cracked visibly. "James, you're overwrought. Surely you understand that family obligations—" "I understand that you've spent years trying to control my life through emotional manipulation and financial pressure," James interrupted, stepping fully into the room with predatory grace. "I understand that you've raised Clarissa to believe her worth depends entirely on winning my approval. I understand that you view my marriage as an opportunity to increase your own power and influence within the family structure." Eleanor watched this confrontation with grim satisfaction, while Clarissa shrank into her chair as though wishing she could disappear entirely. Margaret remained frozen, uncertain whether to retreat or stay to witness the explosion of long-suppressed tensions. "What I don't understand," James continued with gathering force, "is how you convinced yourself that I would sacrifice my personal happiness to serve your ambitions. Did you really believe I would marry a woman I don't love simply because it would be financially advantageous?" Victoria rallied with desperate determination. "Love is a luxury that men of your position can't afford. Your father understood that. His marriage to Eleanor was arranged by their families, and look how successfully it served both their interests." "My father married me for love," Eleanor said quietly, her words carrying absolute authority. "Our families opposed the match because they considered it financially imprudent. We chose each other despite familial pressure, not because of it." The revelation hung in the air like thunder, destroying Victoria's carefully constructed arguments. Margaret looked between Eleanor and James, seeing family resemblance in their shared determination to choose principle over convenience. James moved to stand behind Margaret's chair, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders in a gesture of protection and declaration combined. "Miss Caldwell came here in response to my advertisement for a practical marriage arrangement. What has developed between us goes far beyond practical considerations." Victoria's face had gone white with rage and desperation. "You would destroy your family's future for a woman you've known less than a week? A woman who brings nothing but her own desperate circumstances." "I would choose happiness over duty," James said firmly. "I would choose a partner who challenges me over one who merely complies with my wishes. I would choose authenticity over calculation, even if it means disappointing people who have never bothered to ask what might make me happy." Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes at his passionate defense, even as practical concerns clamored for attention in her mind. The weight of his hands on her shoulders felt like both blessing and burden, representing protection she craved and responsibilities she wasn't certain she could bear. "James," she said softly, turning to look up at him with eyes full of uncertainty, "perhaps we should discuss this privately before making declarations that can't be taken back." His smile was gentle but determined. "Some things don't require extensive discussion, Margaret. Some things are simply right, regardless of their complexity or consequences." Victoria rose from her chair with the dramatic fury of someone seeing carefully laid plans destroyed. "If you marry this woman, James, you'll find that family support has its limits. Clarissa and I will return to Denver immediately, and you can explain to your children why their inheritance was squandered for the sake of romantic foolishness." "That's your choice to make," James replied calmly. "Just as marrying for love rather than advantage is mine." The confrontation ended with Victoria's theatrical exit, Clarissa trailing behind her mother like a beautiful, broken doll. Their departure left the parlor feeling both larger and more intimate, the absence of hostile tension allowing natural warmth to reassert itself. Eleanor moved to embrace her son with fierce pride. "I was beginning to wonder if you had enough of your father's spirit to choose happiness over duty. I'm proud of you for finding the courage to follow your heart." Margaret remained seated, overwhelmed by the evening's emotional revelations and their implications for her future. James's declaration had been everything she might have hoped for, but it also represented consequences she hadn't fully considered. By choosing her, he was defying family expectations, risking financial security, and potentially isolating himself from connections that had shaped his entire life. "Margaret," James said, moving to kneel beside her chair so they were at eye level, "I know this evening has been overwhelming, but I meant every word I said. I would rather face an uncertain future with you than accept a secure one without you." She studied his face in the lamplight, seeing sincerity and determination, but also the weight of sacrifice he was prepared to make. "Are you certain you won't regret choosing love over practical advantage? Your aunt was right about the financial implications." "Money can be earned," he said, echoing his mother's earlier words. "Happiness, once lost, is far more difficult to recover. I've spent 32 years being the dutiful son, making choices based on family expectations and financial responsibility. For once in my life, I want to choose based on what I feel rather than what I owe." Eleanor moved toward the parlor door with tactful discretion. "I'll leave you two to discuss your future privately. But James, you should know that your fathers will establish trust funds that can't be touched by family disapproval. Victoria's threats carry less power than she would have you believe." Left alone together, Margaret and James sat in silence for long moments, the weight of decision settling around them like evening mist. The fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across their faces and emphasizing the intimacy of shared solitude. "Are you frightened?" James asked softly, reaching out to take her hands in his. "Terrified," Margaret admitted honestly. "I came here seeking a practical arrangement that would solve my family's problems. Instead, I find myself considering a choice that might create new ones." "And yet—" She looked into his eyes and saw her own hopes reflected there, along with vulnerability that made him seem less like a territorial aristocrat and more like a man willing to risk everything for love. "And yet I can't imagine returning to the life I left behind, not after discovering what it feels like to be truly seen and valued." James lifted her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her knuckles in a gesture that felt like benediction and promise combined. "Then marry me, Margaret. Not because it's practical or advantageous, but because together we might build something more meaningful than either of us could create alone." The proposal hung between them, simple words that carried complex implications. Margaret knew that accepting would mean embracing uncertainty, defying conventional wisdom, and trusting that love could overcome the practical challenges ahead. But looking at James in the firelight, seeing the hope and determination in his eyes, she found her careful defenses finally crumbling completely. "Yes," she whispered, the word escaping like a prayer. "Yes, I'll marry you." His smile transformed his austere features with pure joy, and when he leaned forward to claim her lips in a kiss that sealed their agreement, Margaret felt as though she was finally becoming the woman she was meant to be rather than merely the dutiful daughter circumstance had required. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Blake Ranch, autumn frost glittering on the window panes like scattered diamonds. Margaret woke to the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway and urgent voices drifting up from the main floor. The events of the previous evening rushed back with crystalline clarity. James's passionate declaration, her acceptance of his proposal, and Victoria's furious departure with promises of consequences that had sounded more like threats. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. Sarah entered with unusual haste, her normally composed demeanor showing cracks of anxiety. "Miss Caldwell, you're to dress quickly and come downstairs. Mrs. Blake, Mrs. Eleanor, that is, requests your immediate presence in the library. There's been developments." Margaret's stomach clenched with foreboding. "What kind of developments?" Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with her role as messenger. Mrs. Victoria left for town before sunrise. Word came back with the milk delivery that she's been to the telegraph office, the bank, and Judge Powell's residence. She's also sent for her lawyer from Denver. The implications struck Margaret like physical blows. Victoria wasn't retreating in defeat. She was mobilizing for war, using whatever legal and financial weapons her position provided. Margaret dressed with trembling fingers, her practical mind cataloging the ways an established family member might damage James's interests if sufficiently motivated by spite and thwarted ambition. The library, which had been a sanctuary of intimate conversation just days before, now felt like a war room. Eleanor sat behind the massive oak desk, documents scattered before her and her face etched with grim determination. James stood near the tall windows, his posture radiating controlled tension as he stared out at the frost-covered landscape. "Sit down, my dear," Eleanor said without preamble. "We need to discuss the realities of your situation before matters progress beyond control." Margaret took the offered chair, noting the formal tone that suggested their relationship had shifted from hostess and guest to something more complex and fraught with consequence. "Victoria's activities this morning confirm my worst fears," Eleanor continued, lifting a telegram from the scattered papers. "She's contacted her lawyer, requested emergency meetings with several business associates, and apparently spent considerable time with Judge Powell discussing what she terms protecting family interests from harmful influences." James turned from the window, his face pale but determined. "Let her do her worst. She has no legal authority over my personal decisions or my inheritance." "Actually," Eleanor said with uncomfortable precision, "she has more influence than you realize. Your father's will contain several provisions designed to prevent imprudent choices from damaging the family's long-term interests." Margaret felt cold dread settling in her stomach. What kind of provisions? Eleanor consulted another document, her voice taking on the careful neutrality of someone delivering unwelcome news. "If James marries without family approval, specifically approval from myself and the designated family trustees, his inheritance becomes restricted. He would retain control of his personal trust fund and current income, but the main ranch properties would be held in trust until he reaches age 40 or demonstrates what the will terms mature judgment in matrimonial matters." "Victoria is one of the designated trustees," James said grimly, "along with her husband's brother and my father's former business partner. All three would need to approve any marriage for me to retain full inheritance rights." Margaret sank back in her chair as the full magnitude of the trap became clear. James's father had created a system designed to prevent exactly what was happening, a romantic choice that might compromise financial stability or family unity. Victoria's threats the previous evening hadn't been empty posturing. She held genuine power to damage James's future if he defied her wishes. How much of the estate would be affected? Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Nearly 70% of the ranch's total value," Eleanor replied with painful honesty. "The house, the prime grazing lands, most of the cattle, and the majority of business investments. James would essentially be reduced to a well-paid employee on his own family's property." The silence that followed was thick with implications. Margaret understood now why Victoria had been so confident in her manipulations, why she had pushed so aggressively despite James's obvious resistance. She held weapons that could destroy his position without requiring his cooperation or consent. "There's more," Eleanor continued reluctantly. "Victoria has also contacted several of our business creditors and suppliers. She suggested that James's judgment has become unreliable due to inappropriate romantic attachments. Some of our credit arrangements could be called in if our financial stability is questioned." James moved to stand behind Margaret's chair, his hands resting on her shoulders in a gesture of protection and solidarity. "Are you trying to convince us that marriage for love is impossible? That family approval is more important than personal happiness?" Eleanor's expression softened with genuine sympathy. I'm trying to ensure you both understand the full cost of defying Victoria's expectations. The decision is ultimately yours, but it should be made with complete awareness of consequences." Margaret reached up to cover one of James's hands with her own, drawing strength from his presence while her mind raced through possibilities and alternatives. The practical woman who had answered his advertisement would counsel retreat, accepting that some prizes were too expensive to pursue, no matter how desperately wanted. But the woman who had discovered herself in his arms rebelled against surrendering to Victoria's manipulations. "What if we delayed the wedding?" she suggested carefully. "Gave Victoria time to accept the inevitable while we worked to secure alternative arrangements?" "Delay would likely make matters worse," Eleanor replied with regret. "Victoria sees any hesitation as weakness to exploit. She would use the time to strengthen her position and increase pressure on potential allies. Judge Powell, for instance, has considerable local influence and has apparently already been enlisted in her cause." James moved around the chair to kneel beside Margaret, taking her hands in his with gentle insistence. "I won't ask you to marry into a family war. If Victoria's threats are too dangerous to ignore, if the cost of choosing love is too high—" "Don't," Margaret interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. "Don't give me an excuse to retreat into cowardice. If we abandon our engagement now, Victoria wins everything. Your compliance with her plans, Clarissa's installation as your wife, and proof that emotional manipulation is more powerful than genuine feeling." Eleanor leaned forward with renewed interest. "What are you suggesting?" Margaret rose from her chair, pacing to the window where morning light revealed the full scope of Blake Ranch, thousands of acres of prime land, carefully tended buildings, livestock that represented generations of selective breeding and investment. The sight might have intimidated her a week ago, but now it simply clarified what was at stake. "We call her bluff," she said with growing conviction. "We proceed with our wedding plans immediately, before Victoria can consolidate more opposition. Force her to actually follow through on her threats rather than simply waving them as weapons." James stood as well, his eyes brightening with hope and admiration. "A preemptive strike rather than defensive retreat." "Exactly. Victoria's power depends on the assumption that you'll surrender rather than accept reduced circumstances. But what if we're prepared to build something new rather than merely inherit something established?" Eleanor studied them both with calculating assessment. "It's a tremendous gamble. If Victoria's threats prove real, you could lose the majority of your inheritance permanently. Or we could prove that love and partnership can create something more valuable than inherited wealth," Margaret replied. "James, you said yourself that you've spent 32 years being the dutiful son. Perhaps it's time to discover what the independent man might accomplish." James crossed to her with swift strides, catching her hands in both of his. "Are you certain? Once we take this path, there may be no return to safety or security." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw her own determination reflected there, along with love that made all practical considerations seem secondary. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. We'll marry immediately, before Victoria can prevent it. Whatever consequences follow, we'll face them together." Eleanor rose from behind the desk, her austere features transformed by something approaching fierce pride. "Then we need to move quickly. A wedding can be arranged within days if we bypass conventional preparations. Judge Powell may have been influenced by Victoria, but the territorial magistrate in Posey Falls owes me several favors from my husband's time in politics." The next hours passed in a blur of urgent activity. Messages were dispatched to the territorial capital, arrangements were made with sympathetic local merchants, and a small circle of trusted allies was quietly assembled. Margaret found herself swept along in Eleanor's efficient campaign, marveling at the older woman's skill in transforming potential obstacles into manageable challenges. By afternoon, word had returned from Posey Falls that Magistrate Coleman would perform the ceremony the following evening, citing urgent territorial business that required immediate resolution of pending matters. Eleanor's influence had also secured the cooperation of several key business associates who agreed to extend continued support regardless of family political complications. "Victoria won't be able to halt the proceedings once they've begun," Eleanor explained as they reviewed final preparations. "Territorial magistrates have authority that supersedes local influences, and Coleman has no fondness for Victoria's heavy-handed tactics." Margaret spent the afternoon in a strange state of suspended animation, simultaneously exhilarated by the speed of events and terrified by their irreversible nature. By tomorrow evening, she would be James's wife, committed to sharing whatever future their defiance might create. The practical concerns that had brought her to Colorado Territory seemed distant now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of choosing love over security. As evening approached, bringing their last night as unmarried individuals, James found her in the garden where late-blooming roses struggled against the approaching frost. He carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, and his expression held the same mixture of anticipation and uncertainty that she felt. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, settling beside her on the stone bench where they had first acknowledged their growing attraction. "Constantly," Margaret admitted with rueful honesty. "But not about marrying you. About whether I'm strong enough to be the kind of wife you need during the difficulties ahead." James set aside his coffee to take her hands, warming them between his palms. "You've already proven your strength by agreeing to take this risk. Anyone can marry for security or advantage. It takes remarkable courage to choose uncertainty for the sake of love." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered around them, sharing the peaceful intimacy of 2 people who had found in each other something worth defending against the world's disapproval. Tomorrow would bring challenges they could only imagine, but tonight they had the precious certainty of mutual choice freely made. "Margaret," James said softly, "whatever happens after tomorrow, I want you to know that these few days have been the happiest of my life. You've shown me possibilities I never dared imagine." She leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "You've done the same for me. I came here expecting to negotiate a practical arrangement, and instead I discovered what it means to be truly seen and valued." Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, autumn sunlight streaming through frost-etched windows like nature's blessing on their unconventional choice. Margaret woke to find a package on her dresser, a wedding dress that Eleanor had somehow procured overnight, elegant in its simplicity and clearly chosen to complement Margaret's natural coloring rather than follow fashion dictates. "Mrs. Eleanor thought you might prefer something designed for you rather than borrowed finery," Sarah explained as she helped with the final preparations. "She said a woman should feel like herself on her wedding day, not like someone playing a role." The ceremony was held in the main parlor, with only Eleanor, Dr. Mullins, Mr. Weaver, and a few ranch hands as witnesses. Magistrate Coleman proved to be a dignified man in his 60s who conducted the proceedings with solemn efficiency, his presence lending official weight to what might otherwise have seemed like romantic rebellion. Margaret felt strangely calm as she spoke her vows, the words carrying deeper meaning than conventional promises because they were being made in full knowledge of the risks involved. When James slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger, the weight felt like both anchor and wings, grounding her in commitment while freeing her from the constraints of purely practical thinking. "By the authority vested in me by Colorado Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Magistrate Coleman intoned with ceremonial gravity. "Mr. Blake, you may kiss your bride." The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and reverent, a promise rather than a claim, witnessed by friends who understood the courage their choice represented. When they separated, Margaret saw tears of joy in Eleanor's eyes and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would not face them entirely alone. The celebration that followed was modest but heartfelt, with Eleanor producing champagne that had been saved for special occasions and Dr. Mullins offering toasts that acknowledged both the happiness of the moment and the uncertainty of the future. As evening approached, Margaret realized that she had become Mrs. James Blake without fanfare or elaborate ceremony, but with the full awareness that their marriage represented a victory of authenticity over expectation. "Mrs. Blake," James said later as they stood together on the front porch, "how does it feel to be part of a family rebellion?" Margaret smiled, finding that the title fit more comfortably than she had expected. Like coming home to a place I never knew I was looking for. Their honeymoon night was spent in the same house where they had met, but everything felt transformed by the simple exchange of vows. The luxury that had once intimidated Margaret now felt like shared abundance, while the responsibilities that had once seemed overwhelming now felt like opportunities for partnership. Morning brought the first test of their united resolve in the form of a furious telegram from Victoria, demanding immediate annulment and threatening legal action to void the marriage on grounds of undue influence and fraud. Eleanor read the message aloud over breakfast, her tone suggesting more amusement than concern. Victoria always did believe that dramatic gestures were more effective than reasoned argument, she observed. Unfortunately for her, territorial law is quite clear about the validity of marriages performed by certified magistrates. Her threats are legally meaningless. What about her financial weapons? Margaret asked, still adjusting to the reality of being included in family strategic discussions. Those remain real, Eleanor acknowledged. Victoria will certainly attempt to restrict James's inheritance and influence business relationships. But she may discover that family reputation suffers more from public displays of vindictive behavior than from unconventional marriage choices. The next weeks proved Eleanor's assessment accurate. Victoria's campaign to punish James's defiance quickly became the subject of territorial gossip, with opinion dividing between those who admired romantic courage and those who deplored family disloyalty. Business associates proved more pragmatic than vindictive, continuing relationships based on mutual profit rather than personal approval. Most significantly, the ranch hands and local community rallied around their new mistress with unexpected warmth. Margaret's practical knowledge and willingness to work alongside them earned respect that no amount of refined accomplishments could have purchased. Within a month, she had established herself as a genuine partner in ranch operations rather than merely decorative addition to the family. "You were right about calling Victoria's bluff," James told her one evening as they reviewed the books together, his arm warm around her shoulders as they worked at the same desk. Her weapons were more impressive in theory than in practice. Margaret leaned into his embrace, marveling at how natural such intimacy had become. "I think your aunt underestimated how much people value authenticity over artifice. Even those who initially disapproved of our marriage have come to respect the genuine partnership we've built." Their first Christmas as husband and wife brought vindication in an unexpected form. Clarissa arrived unannounced on Christmas Eve, travel-worn and obviously distressed. Victoria was notably absent, and Clarissa's first words explained why. "I've left Mama in Denver," she announced without preamble. "I couldn't bear another day of her schemes and manipulations. James, Margaret, I owe you both an apology." The conversation that followed revealed the toll Victoria's ambitions had taken on her daughter. Clarissa had finally recognized that her mother's plans represented imprisonment rather than romantic destiny, that being loved for compliance rather than character was no love at all. "I've wasted years trying to become what I thought James wanted," Clarissa confessed as they sat before the Christmas tree Eleanor had insisted on despite the circumstances. "I never once asked what I wanted, or whether forcing affection could create genuine happiness." Margaret felt unexpected sympathy for the girl who had been raised as a sacrifice to family ambition. "What will you do now?" Clarissa's smile was tentative but real. "Learn who I am when I'm not trying to be perfect for someone else. Maybe discover whether there's a man somewhere who might appreciate authenticity over artful compliance." Eleanor embraced her young cousin with fierce protectiveness. "You're always welcome here, my dear. Real families support individual happiness rather than demanding conformity to imposed plans." James nodded agreement, and Margaret realized that their rebellion had accomplished more than personal happiness. It had freed Clarissa from expectations that would have destroyed her chance for genuine love, and potentially showed other family members that duty need not require self-sacrifice. Spring arrived early that year, bringing news that Victoria had relocated permanently to San Francisco, apparently accepting that her Colorado campaign had failed irreversibly. The ranch prospered under James and Margaret's joint management, their partnership proving more effective than traditional division of masculine and feminine spheres. On their first wedding anniversary, they hosted a celebration that brought together the community that had supported their unconventional choice. Dr. Mullins danced with the banker's widow, Mr. Weaver courted a newly arrived schoolteacher with respectful persistence, and Clarissa laughed with genuine joy as she flirted with a young lawyer who seemed charmed by her natural personality rather than her manufactured accomplishments. "Look what we've accomplished," James murmured as they waltzed together in their own parlor, surrounded by friends whose presence testified to the success of choosing love over convention. Margaret smiled up at her husband, seeing in his eyes the same wonder she felt at how perfectly their gamble had succeeded. "We've proven that happiness built on authentic foundation lasts longer than security based on obligation." Their first child was born the following autumn, a daughter they named Eleanor in honor of the woman who had supported their choice when it seemed most risky. As Margaret held their baby while James read aloud from his father's agricultural journals, she marveled at the journey that had brought her from desperate spinster seeking practical arrangement to fulfilled wife building a genuine partnership. "Do you ever regret answering my advertisement?" James asked one evening as they sat on the porch swing he had built during their courtship. Margaret considered the question seriously, thinking of all the safe choices she might have made, all the practical arrangements that would have solved immediate problems without requiring such dramatic emotional investment. Then she looked at their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, felt the solid warmth of her husband's love surrounding her, and smiled with complete contentment. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "I came here seeking security, but I found something infinitely more valuable. I found home." James's kiss tasted of apple cider and autumn contentment, sealing promises that had grown stronger with each challenge overcome together. The practical woman who had boarded the train in desperate circumstances had been transformed into someone who understood that the greatest security came not from avoiding risk, but from finding a partner worthy of sharing whatever risks life might bring. As the years passed, their marriage became legendary in the territory, not for its dramatic beginning, but for the steady happiness it produced. Young couples seeking to marry against family opposition often sought their counsel, and Margaret invariably told them the same thing. Practical considerations matter, but they should serve love rather than replace it. If you've found someone who makes you want to be better than duty requires, fight for that person with everything you have. Their ranch became a haven for family members seeking refuge from constraining expectations, young people looking for authentic examples of partnership, and anyone who needed to believe that love could triumph over convention when supported by genuine commitment. The rebellion that had begun with a marriage of convenience had evolved into something far more significant, proof that individual happiness and family responsibility could coexist when built on foundation of mutual respect and shared dreams. Margaret's final letter to her sister Emma, written on their 10th wedding anniversary, captured the essence of what they had accomplished. "I answered an advertisement for a practical wife and discovered I was capable of being a woman worth loving for herself alone. The most practical thing I ever did was choose to risk everything for the possibility of happiness. It remains the best decision I ever made." The autumn wind that had once carried promises now whispered of fulfillment, of dreams transformed into reality through courage and commitment. Blake Ranch had become more than property to be inherited. It was home to be cherished, legacy to be built, and testament to the enduring power of authentic love chosen freely and defended fiercely against all opposition. In the end, Margaret and James proved that marriage could be both practical and passionate, that family duty could coexist with individual happiness, and that the greatest inheritance was not property or position but the capacity to choose love over fear, partnership over convention, and authentic connection over calculating arrangement. Their story became part of territorial legend, inspiring others to believe that happiness was worth fighting for, no matter how impossible it might initially seem.